think just quality still photojournalism. I mean, you still can't beat it. And you notice in TV that, you look at major news stories and what are they showing on the nightly news or on CNN? It's still photography. And there's a reason for that. I believe it's more powerful in many situations to just be able to freeze that moment and look at it closer.
Hello and welcome to the Photo Forward podcast, the weekly show where we explore the stories behind some of the greatest photographers and visual storytellers the world over. From their photographic origin stories to finding work-life balance as creative professionals, to how to actually make a living as a photographer, cinematographer, or multimedia creator. We uncover what makes them tick and their shutters click. I'm your host, Ben Brewer. But before we get into today's episode, I want to give a big thanks to everyone who's listening, subscribing, and dropping a rating or review on the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. It means so much to me to really start creating a community around the show. So if you want to hear more inspiring and creative shows like we've been producing, please head over to your podcast app of choice and give Photo Forward a review or a rating to help make this show reach an even larger audience around the world. All right, let's get into the show. When is the last time you, as a photographer, had a picture make itself in front of you? I know that sounds a little bit philosophical and woo-wooey, but stay with me. It's way more practical than you might think. I'm talking about the level of work and care that go into creating a photograph before the shutter ever clicks. Researching your location before you arrive to know the environs, determining the impact, what time of day it is, and how that shapes your image. Just walking around in the space with or without the subject of your photograph to just take in all the possible composition options. And then, after all that, having the dedicated patience to just simply wait for the right decisive moment, peak action, or perfect emotion in the person you're photographing to create that image that might take hours of not taking photos to capture that one ideal moment. That level of dedication to the craft is exactly what we're talking about today with legendary Minnesota photojournalist Brian Peterson. Brian Peterson was born in Duluth, Minnesota, and has enjoyed a 35-year career as a photojournalist, covering stories he cares most about in his home state of Minnesota and around the world. He's best known for his work since 1987 for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, but his photographs have also been published in National Geographic, Sports Illustrated, and the New York Times. Brian has been honored 9 times as Minnesota News Photographer of the Year and has been recognized nationally and internationally for his documentary photojournalism, including a Robert F. Kennedy Award, NPPA's Canon Photo Essay Award, and 3 regional Emmys for his video work. He has photographed the Winter and Summer Olympic Games 5 times, and his sports photography has been honored by the National Baseball and Football Halls of Fame and the National Press Photographers Association. Peterson is the author of 2 books, Minnesota's State of Wonders and Voices for the Land, and winner of 3 Minnesota Book Awards. In today's episode with Brian Peterson, we touch on the importance of connecting with your environment on and off assignment, changes he's experienced in the newspaper photography industry over the past 3 decades, and why so often the time we spend not taking photos with the people around us can lead to the greatest images in the long run. As always, show notes and links to other episodes of the Photo Forward podcast can be found online at photoforward.media/podcast. All right, time for me to get out of the way and let you guys into today's conversation with Star Tribune photojournalist Brian Peterson. Brian Peterson, welcome to the Photo Forward podcast.
Thanks, Ben.
Awesome. So as they say, I think we'll run out of time before we run out of topics to discuss in the interview. But I guess, for someone who's had sort of such a storied career as you've had, in Minnesota and other places as well before that, tell me a little bit about that first moment in your life when you thought, you know what, I think photography is the way I want to go with my career.
Yeah, I guess for me, it kind of came late. I think the first time that I even recognized maybe the power of photography or the ability of photography to communicate was probably in high school. And I remember a buddy of mine, his dad had just come back from a trip to the Boundary Waters, and he actually had a slide projector out and was showing slides of the trip. And I remember looking at his pictures, and generally, you're looking at people's snapshots and you're yawning in and out. And this guy was really pretty good. I noticed immediately that he had control of depth of field and how powerful that was to communicate through photography and be able to isolate an image. And I remember thinking at the time, what in the heck kind of camera was he using? And, I was really kind of curious about how he was able to get such, fascinating images. And I didn't really think too much of it. I did consider maybe getting a camera and trying it myself. He had a 35 millimeter, I think he just had a 50 millimeter lens on it, but it was fast and it had control of the depth of field. And that was probably the first moment where I actually thought, wow, that's interesting. But it wasn't until probably my junior year of college. I started college as a biology major, primarily with the interest of being outdoors, anywhere that would take me to keep me out of an office. But I didn't really take my first photography class till I was a junior, and ended up switching majors, and took my first photography class as a junior and just got hooked after that. And back then it was darkroom days, so the mystery and the magic of a darkroom was it really kind of hooked me in.
So the magic of the darkroom, I think for a lot of photographers coming up nowadays, that's kind of they'll see it in movies, but they can't really appreciate it. They can't get it. I'm I think dating myself and saying I was right on the cusp of the transition from film to digital, in that I started with film and very quickly sort of digital became accessible, became an option really soon thereafter. But take people back to those old darkroom days.
Well, I should back up a little bit there. Between the time that I noticed those first images from the father of a friend of mine, I started going down and noticing pictures in the Duluth News Tribune. I grew up in Duluth and was watching pictures in there, and they had some great photographers that really were capturing images in Duluth that caught my attention. And, thinking of possibly going into photography or wondering about how you'd even get a job as a newspaper photographer. I spent some time down at the darkroom of the Duluth News Tribune. Kind of got to hang out with Chuck Curtis and Joey McLeister and Jack Rendelich, and one of the old timers, Carl Jaros. He was actually a German guy who came from the Leica factory in Germany, and they were actually using Leica cameras at the Duluth News Tribune at that time. They had a special deal, and so they took me in the darkroom, and I was just watching, and they would bring in their assignments from the day and develop the negatives, and then go into the darkroom and watch them, throw paper in the trays and watch these images come up. And it's kind of hard to replicate. I don't know that there's anything in the digital world that really compares to that. We have instant gratification. We can see immediately on the back of the cameras. And I think we're missing a little bit. That whole darkroom experience was certainly something that attracted me early on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Before I was able to make images that I cared about, it was the darkroom that was really the magic.
Yeah. So even that the very act of kind of bringing that photo from your mind's eye into the world, and that kind of delay between it.
Right. And for newspaper photographers in particular, it was a real bonding kind of gathering place. I mean, back when we had one deadline a day, and we'd come in at the end of the day and bring all our stuff in, and you'd go into the darkroom and share stories. And, that was such a communal thing that I really miss. We can sit around computers now, but it's not really the same. So that was another magical part, is just getting together with the other photographers and sharing stories.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I'd love to get into it, later in the interview, talking about, all that's changed in the photojournalism world, and maybe things that haven't changed, but we'll get into that maybe a little bit later.
Sure.
So kind of, it was around, you said around your junior year of college that switch kind of flipped and said, I think I want to start creating photography for a career.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so that switch flipped, and then you said were you a bio major and you kind of finished with that, or kind of talk me through that process?
Yeah, I started at UMD in Duluth. So I was living at home and, kind of still hanging out with my high school friends and doing that whole thing. I was pursuing biology, which I enjoyed, but wasn't terribly good at. So when I started getting into photography, I actually, for some strange reason at UMD, you had to have all these art prerequisites before you could take your first photo class. And I didn't have those, and it kind of kept me from taking my first photo class. So I ended up jumping ship and going over to the University of Wisconsin-Superior. And I was still a biology major there, but I was able to take some photography classes there. And then when I really kind of locked into photojournalism, UWS and Superior wasn't the greatest school for that. So, not having a ton of cash, I was pretty much locked into going to a state school. So I was looking around. It was either the U of M or Bemidji State actually had a pretty interesting program and a couple of really good professors. And so not really thinking that Minneapolis was the place for me, I went to Bemidji for my last 2 years and started. My degree is actually in mass communications with an emphasis in photojournalism. So that's where I really dove in. So I had all my undergrad classes pretty much done, and I was able to dive into the journalism the last 2 years. Worked for the student newspaper, worked for the news bureau, started trying to build a portfolio fairly quickly. And at that time, Bemidji was great for me because I was not competing with a ton of other students. Down at the U of M, the Minnesota Daily was the place to work if you were going to get a newspaper job. And the competition for those positions was fierce. And so I was able to kind of do my work kind of under the radar up at Bemidji and build a portfolio without too much competition.
And you kind of mentioned that it seems like this is going to be sort of a theme throughout. It seems like your knowledge of sort of your attraction to the natural world, it seems like Bemidji is much more of the right place for you, it seemed like.
Yeah, it was definitely. And, it's funny when you go on their website today, they promote it as you can even park for free on the lake in the winter. So the great thing is it was all connected by underground tunnels. So you could literally go from your dorms to class in shorts in the middle of winter. So it wasn't as bad as everybody made it out to be.
So after studying out at Bemidji State, then becomes that sort of pivotal point of now what? That where do I go now in my career? And I think although a lot has changed in the news world, in the sort of general photography world, I think kind of having your perspective on finding that first job, I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know any better. So I was doing a lot of strange things. Photographers at that time, most photographers were copying their best work onto slides and sending sheets of slides to potential newspapers. I didn't know that at the time. I didn't have a lot of mentors showing me the way, and I actually just made contact sheets of my best work and made dozens and dozens of contact sheets that I could send. The good thing is I could send them to newspapers and basically tell them to keep the contact sheets, and the guys that were sending slides out really oftentimes requested them back because they're expensive to make slides. So not knowing any better, that was the technique I used. I had a very deliberate approach in that I knew where I wanted to live. Pretty much in the upper Midwest. I was looking at Minnesota, Wisconsin. I think Des Moines, Iowa was on my list, and then pretty much out in the Pacific Northwest. And I basically wrote to the newspapers that I was interested in, and sent them a $10 check for a couple of weeks subscription. I wanted to see what their newspapers looked like. I mean, this is all before the web, so you couldn't go on and investigate these places. So I wanted to know how they used photography, and In the end, I probably had a list of 100 newspapers that would be a good place to start, and basically just shotgunned cover letters and contact sheets to those newspapers. Pretty much starting from the bottom. A lot of the newspapers had one photographer at the most on staff. Some didn't even have a photographer, and I was kind of proposing that they maybe should get one. So, so that first year was tough, and I didn't. After the summer, after graduating, I didn't really have any takers. I had a good stack of rejection letters, and I still have those in a file somewhere. So I decided I was going to go back to school and maybe try graduate school, and enrolled in the U of M down at the main campus. So I ended up down at the U, and it was probably 2 months into my first year there that I got an offer from a small paper in southern Minnesota, the Faribault Daily News. Basically, scratched out of my original cover letter, just, "We have an opening, give us a call." And there was a phone number. And so I gave them a call, and their photographer was leaving. I think he was going to the AP in Chicago, and they needed a photographer. So I went down and interviewed for that. My advisor told me that, you can always come back to grad school if you want to, but you might want to take this first job and get started. So I did, and moved to Faribault for about a year.
Okay, gotcha. So from there, that first job, I think for a lot of photographers, it's kind of overwhelming, because you really are just thrown into the deep end, and it's every day, it's producing on deadline. What were some of those lessons that you think you learned from that first position down in Faribault?
Well, it was kind of fascinating, because the editor there, when I had my interview, he said, "We're pretty tight on money. We can't pay a ton." I don't remember what the yearly salary was. It was under 10,000 a year, I'm sure. But they also said that if we hire a photographer, we're going to have to, they were going to have to cut their subscription to the Associated Press, which they would get every day through a wire feed. They said, if we do that, then you're going to have to come up with a front page picture every day from the community. So, of course, being naive, but somewhat optimistic, I said, "Oh, sure, I can do that." And so I basically was out hunting for front page pictures every day for that full year.
Wow. I mean, that's a hell of a challenge.
Yeah, it was. I knew every kid in town, and they knew my car by heart. So,
do you have a particular kind of favorite image that you were able to pull together that year?
It's funny, because most photographers and newspapers, they just dread the feature hunting. That day when there's not a whole lot of assignments on the board, and you basically have to go out and look for something. But it really gave me great practice. Probably one of my favorites is a picture of from out in the countryside. It was a picture of a bunch of turkeys up against this fence, and there was a big sign that said, "Turkey caution, turkeys on medication." And, I remember getting half a dozen letters from the community. Got a good chuckle out of that one. So, but it was a lot of the same stuff. I mean, you're looking for things that capture the community on any given day, and it could be anything from a weather feature to minor league baseball game. Just looking for those slice of life kind of moments. It was a good way to kind of get into the community and really figure out what made it tick.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I guess kind of lingering on that a little bit. I mean, what do you think makes a great kind of feature hunting photo? Because I think that's something that, as a freelancer, that could be something really unique, is to have that skill of feature hunting when you're not necessarily on an assignment regularly. So maybe if you have some insight as to how you approach feature hunting, nowadays too.
Yeah, well, one of the keys, I think, is obviously lighting. So I often didn't even bother to cruise during the midday. I would, and generally speaking, kids weren't outside. There wasn't a lot of activity. People were working. Kids were in school. So I did a lot of really, daybreak and late evening kind of stuff. So I could either work with light at night or late evening light, and then just finding something to focus on, like, whatever the activity is, just hang out and photograph it and watch for moments, or watch for the way shadows, a lot of it was just creative, basically making things up creatively that would look good in the paper that people would enjoy, looking back at their own community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that ties in really nicely to something I saw you had posted on social media a little while back. It was a photo of you and your grandson waiting for a steelhead to jump out of the water in the North Shore, and you had the caption, of course, of patience, the capacity to accept or tolerate delay, trouble, or suffering without getting angry or upset. So clearly that has to be sort of a mantra of yours in terms of creating imagery.
Yeah, there's a lot of waiting. I'll tell you, if you can pull everything else together, figure out your composition, have good lighting, and then just wait for moments. I mean, that's what a lot of my job is on almost any given assignment. It's really, kind of analyzing the situation, figuring out where things are going to happen, and then waiting for it to happen. So yeah, it's definitely a good skill to have.
Yeah, and in terms of patience, I mean, is that something you've always had? Is that something you've had to hone as you've worked as a photographer over the years, or is that just something that comes naturally, do you think?
I don't think it really comes naturally. I remember one of my advisors saying early on that, the minute that you think you have the picture, just keep shooting, because 9 times out of 10, you're going to make a better one, and things will change. So I know a lot of photographers that I've worked with over the years, they kind of come into a situation, they get a shot that they like, and then they're done. And I kind of see that as a first step. It's like, you have one in the bag now, so now just perfect it and work harder and wait for a better moment or some better body language or whatever it is that you're really trying to communicate, just focusing on that and kind of honing in even closer. So, when people watch me photograph, they often wonder why I'm not moving around. I mean, some photographers are moving constantly and constantly reframing and looking differently. And I tend to kind of think about that ahead of time in my mind and kind of sort out all those things. And knowing that I don't want to, shoot from that corner because the light is terrible, or, just being aware of your subject and lighting and the composition of the room or whatever situation you're in. I tend to figure out where I want to be and then just wait.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think that's something that's maybe inherent to folks that have started with film as opposed to started with digital? That there's a little more element of patience and waiting for those moments?
Yeah, maybe. I've always worked that way, and it's, and I don't know if I think too much about it. I mean, I think just some self-criticism. I think my images oftentimes are very clean, but I've tried to kind of be aware of that and include, and just not be so, hyper clean, like with super shallow depth of field, including details that are important to either the history or the context of the picture. So I think you can get in a little bit of trouble by doing that, by preconceiving a little too much or kind of visioning the picture before you shoot it. I mean, you always have to be ready for the moment. And to me, that's number one. But I think also subjects, especially when you're doing candid stuff and even feature hunting around the community, I tend to wear down the subject. Like, they get bored with me after a while. I'm not moving and getting in their way, and they're not feeling like they're getting in my way. I'll generally pick a spot and just work the situation rather than creating havoc in the scene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you don't want to become what they're reacting to.
Right.
So we touched on your first job in Faribault at the newspaper there. Mm-hmm. And I guess the sort of crux of this is you've had a very long and really incredible career working with the Star Tribune, and you've seen just about everything over the span of 30 plus years. Tell me a bit about how you got started there, and then we'll get more into kind of how the industry has changed and maybe what hasn't.
Yeah. Well, like I had mentioned earlier, I was very deliberate in my first attempt to get my first job. I knew where I wanted to live. I had a very directed approach to not only where I wanted to work, but where I wanted to live. I think in some ways that was more important than even the quality of the newspaper, at least for my first job. I knew there were places I didn't want to live, and I was I had just gotten married, so it was a collaborative thing. We both had to agree on where we wanted to go. But I had, after that, landing that first job, then I went to plan B. Okay, now where do I want to go? And I want to go to a bigger paper in Faribault, I was by myself. So my main goal after that was to work at a newspaper with at least 2 or 3 other photographers. So we had each other to kind of bounce ideas off on and stuff. So I kind of eliminated half of the newspapers that I initially applied to and then started focusing on larger cities and larger papers. And after a year in Faribault, I was able to land a job in Colorado at the Colorado Springs Sun, which had a staff of, I believe, 5 photographers, a couple lab techs, a couple photo editors, and they were actually doing color. They had just started doing color, and I had no color experience, but they hired me for my eye, and so I went out to Colorado for only about 6 months. Immediately when I got to Colorado, I wanted to get back to Minnesota because Colorado was about a 50,000 circulation newspaper, medium size, and the only place to go from there would really be to a metro. And I knew that I eventually wanted to get back to Minnesota, so I pretty much focused on Duluth and St. Paul and Minneapolis, and just started letting them know that I was very interested and actually sent clippings every couple of weeks. I would send a folder of clippings to all 3 of those newspapers, and got to know photographers on the staff, got to know the photo editors, and just it was very evident that I wanted to work there. So I was fairly persistent.
And then that paid off one day.
Yeah, it did. One of my, I mentioned earlier, I have a stack of rejection letters. One of my favorites is from the Star Tribune, a letter from Earl Seibert explaining how difficult it was to get into photojournalism, and even if there was a job opening, he's got 20 other people he would consider before me. So I kind of saw the handwriting on the wall there, and I really focused on St. Paul, and was able to get a job there. They were just getting into color photography as well, and starting to compete heavily with the Star Tribune. And there was always kind of an agreement across the river that they wouldn't really compete much, at least for circulation, which is very weird. You couldn't get a Star Tribune delivered in Minneapolis or in St. Paul, and you couldn't get a St. Paul paper delivered in Minneapolis. So it was kind of a unique situation. But I figured if I ever wanted to work in Minneapolis, the best way to get there would be to go and work for the competition and beat them on a daily basis. So that was my plan.
Nice. And for how long? What was that first? It was a couple years at the Pioneer Press, correct?
I believe it was 4 years at the Pioneer, and then I got a call from Earl Seibert, who had sent me that beautiful rejection letter and asked if I wanted to maybe meet and talk about a job. So,
there's a great book that has come out recently, and the title is "So Good They Can't Ignore You."
Yeah.
It seems like that was the approach you went for.
Well, and it's funny because Minneapolis, the Star Tribune, or the Tribune at that time, was a very well-regarded photojournalism paper, and I just didn't have the pedigree to kind of just step in there and expect to get hired. And so the best way for me was really to kind of work for the competition, because the other editors, I think, in some ways noticed my work as much as the photography staff. So and we competed daily on every assignment. I mean, we were always shoulder to shoulder on assignments throughout the day. And so the next morning, it was always, who did better on that assignment kind of thing. It was very motivating. And, but I knew that not only the photo staff was noticing, but that the other editors were noticing. If they ever got beat on a big story, they would recognize it. So it was a good way for me to kind of get my foot in the door.
Was there a little element, you're a younger photographer at that point. Was there an element of kind of competition, competitiveness that drove you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. But, there was a lot, most guys getting hired at that time were younger photographers. And I know when I got hired in St. Paul, they had not had a hire in, I think, 16 years. And then over the span of about 4 years, they hired John Doman, myself, Gene Pieri, Joe Rossi, Rich Marshall. There was like a group of 5 or 6 of us that came in as they were kind of moving into color, and we kind of just took control. We were doing photo stories, and And it was really a fun time to be working for a newspaper, especially with stiff competition.
Right. That idea of shoulder to shoulder with where you eventually kind of wanted to head to is an interesting concept of working with / against them.
Right. And I was actually very happy in St. Paul. I wasn't really pursuing the Star Tribune anymore at that point. I mean, we were having a great time in St. Paul. So I was a little bit surprised when I got the call, but I could see the handwriting on the wall. The travel budget was bigger, the staff was bigger. I mean, just everything was bigger and better there. They had a bigger reach, double the circulation. So it was a tough choice to leave St. Paul, but it was the right one in the end.
So I guess we've kind of buried the lead a bit that you do end up, of course, over at the Star Tribune for quite some time. So, aside from the obvious, of course, of technology and all of that, what do you see as sort of the biggest shift in photojournalism, in sort of the realm of visual storytelling over the course of the 30 plus years at the Star Trib, I guess specifically to the Star Trib, or just more generally in the industry?
Well, I think certainly the advent of digital is huge, and video, and social media, all three of those things really changed the whole industry dramatically, I think, and for the better in many ways. And maybe at the sacrifice of still photography in some ways as well. Luckily, the Star Tribune has still been very committed to still photography. We still have a staff of 16 photographers, which is very unusual. But we do split a lot of our time with multimedia, social media, video. It's most of the big projects we're still doing, outstanding still photography work too. And but there's always going to be a video component in social media as well.
And anything that's really stuck out as, the more things change, the more they stay the same?
Well, I think just quality still photojournalism. I mean, you still can't beat it. And I think even you notice in TV that, you look at major news stories and what are they showing on the nightly news or on CNN? It's still photography. And there's a reason for that. I believe it's more powerful in many situations to just be able to freeze that moment and look at it closer. No, the biggest thing I think is that's changed for the worse is that it really is. We've watched the demise of the staff photographer. I mean, there's not many. I think St. Paul is down to 2 photographers now, and most newspapers around the country, just their staffs have been gutted. And I think that's sad. I mean, that's one of the things that we at the Star Tribune have always enjoyed, is just the ability to work with other great photographers. We're all different. We can all learn from each other. And it's just, it's even different than a magazine, I think, that has a staff, because generally at magazines, you're not going into the office and comparing notes on a daily basis. But so I think that's one of the big things that I'm really sad to see, is the loss of the staff jobs. Yeah,
that is just one of those trends in the industry that is just, like you said, it is really heartbreaking. To what do you think you credit the Star Tribune putting that kind of focus into still photography, into storytelling in that way that's so different than so many other places?
Yeah, it's really hard to say, because we've had a long history of great photojournalism, but so have a lot of other newspapers. I mean, when you think about all the great ones that have kind of gone to the wayside, the Dallas Morning News, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Washington Post. I mean, they're still around, but they're not doing the kind of photojournalism that they used to be. I will say that, just having local ownership now with Glenn Taylor is huge. I mean, he's kept into the newsroom and pressure to kind of go at the staff, whether with, cutting reporters or photographers. It's pretty easy for most newspapers to say, well, we'll just give the reporters a phone and they can take the pictures. We've always, we've had good editors that see the value in good photography. And, that's certainly something that I, and I'm sure all the photographers appreciate there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And speaking of the value of good photography, I'd love to get into a little bit on some of your nature photography that it seems so core to kind of all of the work that you created, and it's just beautiful. It's really stunning work, and has become part of that arrangement of great work that is presented in the Star Trib. So tell me a little bit about where the sort of idea for your book, State of Wonder, came into play, and how you went about that whole process.
Yeah. Well, I think just going back a little bit, newspaper photographers are generalists, basically. You don't get hired as a sports photographer or as a picture storyteller or a political photographer or a nature photographer. You really have to do everything. But once you are hired, you can kind of seek out your own path. And, I wouldn't say from day one, but at least 10 years into my time at the Star Tribune, I started, my natural interests were in the environment and environmental issues. And so I would just naturally kind of chum up with the environmental reporters and kind of keep tabs on what they were up to and let them know that, if they ever need a photographer for a project, let me know, and that kind of thing. So over the years, I would say because of my interest in that, it kind of carved out a niche for me there to do that. And then, if you're successful at it, then they come to you, kind of a go-to person for that kind of a story if they need it. So I would say, that can work in the freelance world too. I think if you do the work that you care the most about, that's the work that's going to come to you eventually. So I encourage young photographers to really find out what that is that they care most about and start working on it. Even if they don't have assignments, start working on personal projects that you can be known for.
Absolutely.
The environmental work, of course, for me was just an excuse to get out of the Twin Cities. I mean, I like the Twin Cities and Minneapolis, but if I can get out of town, I'm going to be on the first car out, 35W North. So,
and putting together a book of all of your nature work for all of that, and pulling it together, and editorial choices and everything. Tell me a little bit about State of Wonder, I guess, and a little background for people who may not have heard of it before.
Sure. Well, of course, and I'm not sure it's even so much now, but back in the day, everybody wanted to work for National Geographic. I mean, that was the dream job. I mean, you got to travel the world and go on exotic assignments and spend a year on one assignment. I mean, it was everybody's dream job. And so to me, the State of Wonders project, it kind of came to me from the travel editor, Kerry Westenberg, who wanted to kind of showcase Minnesota in all four seasons, in all four corners of the state. And I had been doing a lot of environmental work up to that point, and most of the stuff that I was doing were showing all the disasters and the sediment in the rivers and the pollution and the burns and the blowdown up in the boundary waters. And so this was an opportunity to kind of showcase why it is that we should even care about environmental issues. And all of that work actually was done in 1 year. It wasn't a lifetime of work.
Wow.
We actually planned it out, figured out where we wanted to go, and then I shot that over the course of a year. And it ran originally in the newspaper in 4 special sections, one each season. And then I got tremendous feedback from the readers, and everybody was wondering if we were going to do a calendar or make prints, and people wanted to order prints and wondered if there was going to be a book. And so I kind of went to the paper and said, I think there's something here. If you guys are at all interested in publishing a book, I think we could pull it together. And they kind of hemmed and hawed, and they really weren't set up to do books anymore. I mean, they used to do quite a few books every year, but that was just one of those things that kind of fell by the wayside. And so they decided that they weren't going to do it. It was going to be quite expensive. It was going to be a coffee table book. And so I actually approached them to have them release the copyright back to me to produce the book myself. And so I kind of took that on as another full-time job, and they agreed and released it to me. The irony is that now they sell it themselves, so they buy books from me and sell it on their website.
It all works out in the end.
It all works out, yeah.
So do you have kind of a process, I guess, related to that? Do you have sort of a process behind, creating photo stories or pursuing these long-term intense projects?
Yeah, it's a little bit of serendipity, but also a lot of planning. Probably more planning than you could imagine. For that particular project, I mean, I do a lot of visual research online, just Google image searching. If I don't know a place, I mean, that's almost the first thing I do is see what other photographers have done and where the cool places are, and not so much to copy what I'm seeing, but to know where I might want to go look for my own pictures. And that was a good example of, we didn't, for State of Wonders project, we didn't really want to just showcase everything that everybody knew about Minnesota. We did some of the obvious things, but most of them were pretty hidden gems that most people weren't familiar with. So finding those places were as much about driving around and then maybe revisiting places when the light was better or the season was better, or whatever it is I was looking for was better. So I probably spent as much time doing visual research for those projects. And then when I went out to shoot, I would often, if you're going up to northwestern Minnesota, that can be a 4 or 5 hour drive just to get up there. So I spent a lot of time in the car. I kind of had to plan for weather. And it was a logistical challenge for sure.
How do you think you balance, or can one balance? This is kind of more of a personal question, I suppose. Yeah. But finding that work-life balance is such a thing. Does it exist? When we as photographers, we're out on the roads hours and hours upon end and working to the bone, trying to create something that we're so passionate about. How do you find that sort of balance between personal life and professional life?
Yeah. That's a hard one. Most of the best photographers are pretty much, I don't know, single-minded, I guess, in some ways. Mm-hmm. When you think about the best photographers around the world, they're either very focused on one subject or they cover wars or whatever it is they do. Their whole life is dedicated to that. And that, in some ways, is how you get those amazing images. You become an expert in whatever subject it is you're working, and you become the best. I mean, just because of the sheer tenacity of going after it. But it's often at the sacrifice of any kind of family life or friends or social life. And, when I started newspapers, it's probably the one thing that attracted me even more than my dream of being at the National Geographic was being able to have some control over my time and being able to kind of benefit from working 40 hours a week and not 80, and being able to be home in the evening if I wanted to be and travel if you wanted to or if you could. So over the years, that's the one thing that number one, I didn't want to burn out. I wanted to enjoy this job as long as I could. And I saw a lot of older photographers at newspapers that were completely burnt out. And so, making sure that I balanced that over the years was a huge priority for me. And my wife will be the first one to tell you that when I'm on the job or if I'm working, I'm not terribly good company. I'm pretty focused, and I have a hard time thinking of anything else other than what I'm doing. So I have kind of an interesting story. I was working on a story on the Superior Hiking Trail. I think it was a couple summers ago now, and I basically was following a hiker who was doing the 320 miles in 18 days, and so I was hopscotching in and out of her travels along the trail. And my wife and daughter decided they were going to come up and surprise me and celebrate my 40th birthday up in Grand Marais when I was up there. I think after about one lunch and one dinner, they decided that they were just going to enjoy it up there by themselves, and they abandoned me and let me go back to work. But I tend to be quite focused when I'm actually doing the work. But I do find myself, very, very much trying to keep, separate the two and making sure there's time for other things in life as well.
Yeah. What do you think you credit that? You mentioned, the important word burnout. What do you think you credit to not experiencing that during your career?
I have so many other interests that I have a hard time focusing. And that's one thing I like about newspapers as well, is that we don't really focus on one subject. So we're doing different things all the time, and which I love. And the same with my personal life. I mean, I love doing a lot of other things. So I think it's just a matter of maybe I wasn't quite as passionate about photojournalism as others. I wasn't as driven, maybe. I'm not sure what it is, but I found it to be a good balance.
Yeah, that sort of speed for the long haul.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'll tell you, when I'm working, I mean, I'm putting it all out there. So for me, that's the difference. I mean, being able to throttle it back and step it up when you have to. I mean, there's certainly a lot of assignments when you have to perform, and the only way to do that is to be very focused.
And related to that, I guess a question that I know I struggle with constantly. Can you turn it off when you're doing in your personal life, or are you photographer all the time and it's hard to turn it off?
It's hard to turn it off because I see the world as a still photograph. I mean, I find myself, and my kids and my wife will tell you that I'm always looking at things, and I almost always have a camera with me, and it gets annoying sometimes when I go off on a tangent to try to shoot something, and I'll go out to shoot the stars of the Northern Lights. I'll come back in 3 hours later, everybody's sleeping and wondering where the hell I went. But I don't. It's kind of hard to describe. It kind of depends on the potential too. If the potential is there for greatness, then you ramp it up a bit too, I think. When you know the light is perfect or that the potential for a great moment is there. But if it's not, I can turn it off immediately. With the nature stuff, if the light is bad, I don't even bother going out. So
yeah, and like you said, it's as much about surrounding yourself with the people that are okay with you.
Yeah.
Always having a camera on and always kind of thinking about it in the back of your mind.
Right. I mean, the good thing is that now they all have cameras too because of the phone. That everybody's always carrying a camera anyway, so I don't get quite so much heat.
Yeah, we're not the weird guys that carry our camera around anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So in your career at the Star Tribune, I'd love to kind of talk about something that you've definitely incorporated into it now is kind of working as a photo coach, and you've probably worked with a ton of interns that have come through the door at the newspaper. Tell me a little bit about what that's been like for you. And then we'll get into kind of what are some of the mistakes you see and just kind of some lessons for younger photographers, whether they want to get into news photography or not.
Yeah. I'm always so impressed with the eye that young photographers have compared to what I had and other colleagues had at that age. They're so much more sophisticated in just the way they see things. And I think the biggest thing is trying to direct them in a way that they can take that vision and apply it to a story and then start to think about storytelling, not just making a cool picture. Because I think that's the one thing I see most in portfolios is that they're either kind of cookie cutter, they have all the formulas filled, but there's no passion there. There's no, if I look at a portfolio, I should really be able to tell who you are in some ways because of what you've photographed and how you photographed it. Oftentimes they all look alike, even though they might be, compositionally excellent or technically perfect. I think being able to redirect, and that might just come from experience, but just redirecting that excellence into storytelling.
Mm-hmm. What do you think really displays that personality of the photographer? Where does that come from?
In the photographs, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think it just comes from what you're passionate about. I mean, if you look at the body of my work over the years, I think it would be pretty obvious what I care about. And I think that's probably harder as a young photographer. You don't really know what you care about yet, maybe. You're still developing that. But there are certain things that, I knew even from high school days that I number one, I liked outdoors. I liked the environment. So finding stories that incorporate that, I've always done that over the years. And that's where some of my best work has come from.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So young photographer, just start to channel that right away, try to, even if it changes. And I also like to encourage photographers to work on kind of broader themes that they can take elsewhere if they're going to move. If they move, don't start a project that you can't do somewhere else. And be able to continue, maybe even over the course of your lifetime, have an amazing body of work on a certain subject that you could bring to other places.
Oh, that's really interesting. I think we're often so encouraged to niche down in our work and make it the smallest possible story or whatever. But I think that's a really interesting approach to kind of approach a thematic element to your life and see how that changes.
Yeah, yeah. And it just keeps you going creatively too. I think it's easy to get bogged down when you don't have the job or things just aren't going right. But if you've got that project in your back pocket that you can kind of pull out and go explore for even a couple hours on any given day, and just continue to add to the body of that work.
That's really interesting. I like that. What do you think is one of the more challenging assignments or projects that you've worked on, and tell me a little bit about that, how you worked through it, or what was challenging about it necessarily?
Yeah. Well, the AIDS project was probably my most challenging project emotionally. We talk about balancing work and family life. That project probably took more out of me than anything else I've ever done at the Star Tribune. It was a 6-year project on a family from southern Minnesota that was infected with the AIDS virus, and I basically spent 4 years with them as they dealt with everything from their 5-year-old daughter dying, and then the mother dying, and the 2 boys basically being orphaned after their dad was very sick. And it was just one of those stories that I got into almost as a daily assignment for the features department on a family. They wanted to do a story about a family living with AIDS. And the reporter and I went to a conference in Minneapolis and met Nancy Simon, who was just had found out that her family was infected. And we approached her about possibly spending some time with them at their house. At the time, they were pretty much asymptomatic, and things hadn't changed a whole lot. But they agreed to let us come down. They didn't really agree to being in the newspaper yet, but they didn't really know kind of how this infection was going to change their lives. And so we just, basically approached them and wanted to have the door open to us. And it turned out to be a 6-year project.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And how do you sustain a project over that length of time? Like that seems like there's so much uncertainty in kind of where the story's going to go. How is this going to change and evolve?
Yeah, I didn't really have a blueprint for how to do it. This was really the first long-term documentary project that I had ever done, and wasn't really expecting it to be that when I started. And so I was pretty much just working on instincts and knowing that I wanted to spend time. And as long as they were willing to keep the door open, I was going to keep going. And the reality is, even over the 6 years of the project, they were about an hour and a half south of the Twin Cities. So it wasn't just like I could just bop in whenever. So I had to make deliberate visits. But it turned out that it was probably, I think I figured out over the course of the 6 years, it was maybe 1.5 visits per month. Sometimes it was obviously more intense, but other times I'd go 3 months without seeing them. It was a lot of communication, just checking in. What are you guys up to this week? Are you doing anything? How is this affecting you? They had issues like having to come out to their own community. But when we started the story, they weren't even out to some of their own family members, and they had to deal with how to come out to their Catholic church, and their daughter was in school, going to start kindergarten. So there was a lot of things that we knew we wanted to be there for, and for the first 2 years, the door was pretty much wide open, and then they started having marriage troubles, and the father was not as excited about us being around as she was, the mother, who was very committed to the story. So it really got dicey. We had a lot of doctors that didn't want to be photographed because they didn't want other patients to know they were taking care of AIDS patients. So it, it was not only emotionally tough, but it was logistically, um, it was a nightmare.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What do you credit the success of building that relationship with the family to? I think we hear that, and that sounds that sounds so difficult. I think for a lot of us nowadays to think about that level of being that connected, that close with essentially what started out as strangers not that long ago.
Right. It's all about trust, and they trusted us. We were not trying. We were very honest with what we were there for, and that we were there to tell their story, no matter where it went. And we all understood that at any given time that this could change and that they could stop. It wasn't like they had to commit for 6 years. That just never happened. Um, and certainly people like the husband, he was basically out of the picture for 3 years, and we weren't able to photograph or report anything of his involvement, which left a fairly sizable hole in the story. But it also was he had kind of left. They ended up separating, and he wasn't even living in the home, so it wasn't a major. I mean, we would have liked to have had it, but you just had to go with what you could get. So yeah, that's tricky. And one of the things that did help us is that over the course of the 6 years, I think we ran four different special sections. So after the first story ran, after the first year, everybody could kind of see what kind of work we did and did with their story, and that opened up a lot of doors for the continuing that story. People trusted us more. They knew what we were up to. Other family members that were leery, they could see what we were there for, and quite honestly, we almost became members of the family at some point. If we weren't there, people were asking where we were.
Wow.
And that was just that was a commitment and a long-term story. But when you look at the actual time spent, it's not that overwhelming if you think about it. If you're a photographer and can't spend a day and a half per month on a project, most people can usually carve out that kind of time.
Yeah, it's a good kind of mental check to think, all right, long-term projects, these big ambitious documentary, anything, it doesn't have to be as overwhelming as we make it out to be.
Right. And one of the things too that I found throughout the project was that after a while, I didn't feel like I had to be there for every moment. That even when Candace, their daughter, passed away, I was actually on a family vacation and ended up having to fly back for the funeral, but I didn't even take a picture at the funeral. And it wasn't until 2 days later when I went out to the gravesite with Nancy, the mother, who spent time there alone, that I made probably my most powerful picture of the project, when she was there just tending to the gravesite by herself. And when I look back at the pictures that I could have made at the funeral, there wasn't really anything there that would have added to the story. You know what I'm saying? It was just that important. That moment that we often feel like we have to have, it wasn't important. There's other moments that are even more important.
Absolutely. And on that note, thinking about where we are in terms of a society right now, to date the episode a bit, we are still in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic and recovering from the unrest in the United States. What role do you see as news photographers for either, I'm not sure how to put this exactly, but what is the role of the newspaper photographer in telling those hard stories? To what degree are we responsible for how people react to all of this,
Yeah. react to our stories or react to the pandemic itself? Or
yeah, I guess I'm thinking more specifically in terms of, being in Minneapolis. The Star Tribune and the photographers on it were tasked with covering the unrest here following the killing of George Floyd. And we were, and you were all tasked with how do you represent that in a way that is truthful, that is honest, that is, honest photojournalism of our community during all of that. And sort of, I guess I'd love to hear sort of your take on what it means to be a photojournalist, documenting and doing all of that for these life-changing things that we're going through.
Yeah, that I think is probably one of the biggest challenges. And, when a story that big happens in your own backyard, you look at it differently than you look at something like that happening elsewhere. And, I think that's when photographers really look at what they're doing and what they're presenting. And not even so much what they're shooting, but how it's being presented after they shoot. I didn't do a lot of the on the street coverage of the George Floyd protests, but I watched almost all of it. And I know how those protests go. And I know that there are agitators that get in those groups that cause 90% of the trouble. And they're probably 5% of the people there. And what responsibility do photographers have to not migrate to the troublemakers? I mean, that's what we've always done. We go where the fire is. It's pretty hard to resist that when you're there covering it and to make it in some ways look a lot worse than it was and making everybody out to be an arsonist. I think in some ways that's an editing decision as much as a photographer. I think we need to shoot what's there. And we can't avoid shooting that stuff. But in terms of presentation, I think the Star Tribune actually does a pretty good job of that. And I know a lot of photographers will feel that maybe their best work is not being showcased, but it might be because it's not balanced or it's not, it doesn't speak the truth of the larger event. I don't know. It's a really tough one. I think as a local photographer, you get kind of protective of your own community as well. And if you would have watched that from a hotel room in Boston when Minneapolis was burning, you would have thought the whole town was burning down. I mean, just how it gets presented. So every time I see, I do blame most of this on CNN and the big boys in the broadcast journalism. I mean, I think they do a disservice on most of those big events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would tend to agree with you on that. What's the relationship like between, I could say specifically you working with editors at the paper? What is that back and forth like? Maybe not specifically on a project of that magnitude, but in general, what does that relationship look like?
Well, it used to be different, and it used to be better, I think, because when we were going to the office, we were meeting face to face, and we could look over a take. And back in, if we want to go really far back, I mean, our daily assignments were often looked at frame by frame over a light table, and then you'd make a half a dozen prints, and then you'd make a dozen prints, and a half a dozen of those would go to a news meeting for discussion. But now it's I would say a lot more is dependent on the photographer's initial edit, because we're often sending from the field. Editors can request for more images or they can ask questions, but there's not nearly the give and take that there used to be on a daily basis. Projects are the exception. They're generally pretty well tightly edited, but photographers are pretty much responsible. Like on a night of the George Floyd protests, I mean, that stuff's coming in on the fly, from people's phones, and oftentimes making it on the web within minutes. There's not a lot of discussion about the broader picture at that point. So, I think that's the other issue, is the immediacy of social media. And, you don't get the time to talk about it and have those conversations.
Mm-hmm. What do you think those finer points are for the photographers that are now, by and large, editing their own work, especially freelancers, that's their whole job they have to do the editing and the culling and what they're submitting. What do you think are the sort of key points that photographers should keep in mind when they don't have that over the light box table looking at a take kind of situation?
Yeah. I mean, I think in the perfect world, there's a discussion, because even on a mundane assignment, I might send in a half a dozen pictures thinking that, 3 of the 6 are just supplemental pictures that would be good for a package or a slideshow or whatever. And then an image is selected as the lead on a cover story. And you're like, oh my God, why did they pick that one? Why didn't we have that conversation? So, you don't want to self-edit, and you want to give them choices, but at the same time, I always feel really uncomfortable when there's not a conversation. If it's a really delicate situation, I'll often call and make that request. Say, okay, here's the deal in this situation. We can't use that, as a lead image. And it's often about placement as much as it is whether it's used or not. And I think you'll see that more in the Star Tribune, where some of the more sensational pictures will not be on the cover. They'll be inside. And I know photographers, I've heard them say, well, we sure didn't use the best picture that day. And, it might not have been the best quote unquote picture, but it might have been the one to use. So
absolutely.
We have good photo editors, so we don't generally have a big issue with that. And if they have a question, they know they can call us. We have our phones in our pockets.
Exactly. Well, it is all at our fingertips now.
The one thing I will say is that I think I miss the most is just not being involved in those conversations. Like if it's a big news day, we'll be hanging around the news huddle listening to the discussions. So you're involved in that whole process, where now we're all just kind of removed. And so I don't think those discussions are happening.
Yeah, and like you mentioned in the sort of pre-interview, we're talking about, it feels like everybody's a freelancer now in some ways, because nobody's having those conversations.
Yeah. I've never done a lot of freelance work over the years. I'll do a few. But I did a geographic book project one summer and spent 3 weeks out in Massachusetts. And I must have I'm sure I shot over 200 rolls of film, which isn't much when you think about it now. But I never had one conversation with the editor until the book was published, which I was shocked.
That's wow. Yeah. That's stunning.
And I know Geographic does better with their own photographers, but as a freelancer, I felt totally out of the loop. That was not a good feeling.
Absolutely. Well, Brian, like I said, we could talk for hours and get into even more. Maybe we'll have to have you back on for a round 2 at some point. But we can start to wrap things up today with sort of the lightning round questions of a few kind of brief questions to get a little bit more about you, and then let people know where they can find more of your work online.
Sure.
All right. What's the one thing in your bag that you'd never leave home without?
My phone.
For a camera purpose or
for everything?
Yeah.
Phone, video, audio, note taking, research, making a phone call. It's shocking how valuable that tool is.
Exactly. What's the most important thing you think you've said no to in your career?
Oh, that's a hard one, because I have said no to some pretty big assignments. Probably saying no to the first Iraq War. It was early. Well, it was midway through my career, and I had young kids, and I couldn't take the risk. And I remember thinking at the time too that it was back when they did the whole embedded situation, and I just felt so weird about that situation and being embedded. It just felt so restrictive. We had to do what we could do with whatever access they gave us, but I remember thinking that was kind of not the best way to cover a war.
Yeah. Well, there's something to be said for trusting your gut.
Yeah.
What do you do outside of photography that recharges you?
Well, at the moment, I generally like hanging out with my grandkids. I have 5 grandkids now, all of them under age 7, and they're just a blast. and they keep me young, and I love seeing the world through their eyes. It's just so cool. Prior to having grandkids, I spend a lot of time outdoors. I mean, that's probably the one thing. I am a hunter. I'm kind of a fanatic deer hunter. Spend a lot of time sitting in a tree in November, and haven't gotten a deer for a couple of years, so I'm not the most successful deer hunter. But I really find that to be it's almost meditative to be out there and watch the sun come up and set in one day. So,
what's one thing you think separates good photographers from great ones?
Oh boy. I think like I mentioned earlier, the great photographers are pretty single-minded and dedicated. But maybe more on a little less dramatic thoughts about it is just the best photographers really have good perception and observation, and they're able to kind of translate that into a great photograph. I mean, they can assess a scene or a situation and make a picture that really just makes you stop and look.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think just, not just shotgunning and you're running around shooting as much as you can, but really looking at a situation and being perceptive.
Mm-hmm. And finally, where can people see some more of your work or connect with you online?
That's a good question. I've kind of got a love-hate relationship with social media, so you're not really going to find me on there much at all. I have a personal Facebook page. I have a website, brianmarkpeterson.com, but I just checked it tonight, and half the links are broken. I put that site up when the Star Tribune was going through bankruptcy, thinking that I was going to have to join the freelance ranks, and I haven't really touched it since, so it's pretty old. There are some projects on there. I think the AIDS Project is still on there. And then the State of Wonders site is stateofwonders.com has got the State of Wonders project on there and some more information on that. I'm hoping to rebuild my website here in the next year or so and kind of pull everything together. But at the moment, if you just Google my name, Brian Mark Peterson, and Star Tribune, you'll probably see a majority of my stuff kind of in recent chronological order.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure everyone will keep their eyes peeled for the updated website to see all of your work.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on the Photo Forward podcast, Brian.
All right. Thanks, Ben.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone, for listening to today's amazing episode with Brian Peterson. As we mentioned in the intro to today's episode, if you've got a question or anything you want to ask on the show that I'll respond to in an AMA style, I've set up a page at photoforward.media/connect, or feel free to send an email or voice message to connect@photoforward.media, and we'll tackle those Q&As in some upcoming episodes. Enjoying listening to the Photo Forward podcast? Want to hear more thought-provoking, engaging discussions about photography, creativity, or freelance business? Well, this is where you come in. We want to get the word out as wide as possible about Photo Forward and reach as many listeners as possible. And the best way to do that is through reviews and recommendations on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you consume your podcasts. If you want to support more engaging and intimate conversations with photographers, cinematographers, and storytellers the world over, head on over to the Photo Forward page and drop a review to let me know how you all are enjoying the show, or even just a rating. It means a ton to growing the show, and I personally read through each and every review to make this show the best damn visual storytelling podcast out there. Thanks for listening, everyone, and as always, keep seeing, keep thinking, and keep putting your best photo forward. Catch you all in the next one.